Hi all, and welcome to the latest edition of my series looking at American history. Today we're in 1857 looking at the Dred Scott case. This is the latest key event in the movement towards the Civil War, with the hardening positions of the North and the South and rising tensions between those two sections. So Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri. Now, him and his family had accompanied his owner to both Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory before returning to Missouri. And on this basis, he felt that he should be entitled to freedom. Him and his family should be entitled to freedom. And he went to the Missouri courts in the 1840s to say, look, according to precedent, according to what's happened before, me and my family should be free. So start off with the Missouri courts, having unsuccessfully attempted to purchase his freedom, he got the help of an abolitionist group and advisors, and he sued Emerson, his owner, for his freedom, and he received financial assistance from a guy called Peter Blow. Now, there was a series of previous cases that suggested that the law was on Scott's side, Dred Scott's side, and that really he should be granted his freedom. Now, one member of his family in particular seemed really to have a really clear-cut case, which was his daughter Eliza, who'd actually been born on a steamboat between a free state and a free territory, and therefore really she should have been free by birth. But this hadn't happened, and so Dred Scott went through the courts to try and get it. It was expected that he would win this case based on the precedent, particularly on the basis of the judge that he got a judge called Alexander Hamilton, and not that one, but a different one. And this judge seemed to be sympathetic to slave freedom suits. But he lost the case on a technicality, and this is to do with ownership. His ownership had passed to Irene Emerson, and he struggled to prove that he'd actually been enslaved by her. And so, on this technicality of missing paperwork, essentially, he didn't gain his freedom. Judge Hamilton then kind of grants a new trial to Dred Scott for various reasons, including cholera outbreaks and a fire at the courthouse. This doesn't actually take place until 1850. During that time, Scott and his family are held in custody of the county sheriff. They continue to lease out his services. So he's not living with an individual owner, but him and his family they're being leased out for work by the county sheriff. And this 1850 trial, him and his family win. But Irene Emerson, is unwilling to accept the loss of her 4 slaves and the substantial kind of legal bills this would have left her with. So she appealed to the Supreme Court in Missouri. Again, with time goes on, and we get all the way through to November 52, and the Missouri Supreme Court then reverses the decision and suggested that the Scots were still slaves, and they should have sued for freedom whilst living in a free state or free territory, and they might well have been granted then, but by Missouri law, because Missouri is a slave state, then they were still slaves. And part of this, we can see with all the time that was dragged on, that the sectional tension and all these arguments about slavery and territories and different states and who controlled it, it all changed in the time frame. We think about the early bit, we're talking we're talking about the time around the Mexican War, pre-1850 compromise. We get all the way through to this decision. 1850 compromises happen, tensions are rising, and so we're in a different context. The Blow family, who had been financially supporting Dred Scott through this, kind of thought this was kind of the end of the day, and they couldn't make any progress, so they stopped financially supporting his legal case. It is, however, taken on by Roswell Field. Now, there's confusion about ownership of the Scots at this point. John Sanford, who is Irene Emerson's brother, is the guy whose name goes into the court documents as it's Scott versus Sanford. And we have a Missouri Supreme Court decision that, again, the Scott family remain in slavery. And so they then decide to go all the way up to the US Supreme Court. Now, the decision on this is finally made in 57. It was divided on the judgment, so we get the majority judgment. There weren't a minority judgment that came in saying that it wasn't right that Scott stayed in slavery. One of the most famous things about the judgment was that Buchanan actually referred to the case in his inaugural address. He said that he was ready to cheerfully submit to the verdict and urged everybody in the US to do exactly the same thing. The court's decision said essentially that Black Americans, whether slave or free, didn't have the same rights as white citizens. They essentially, the court saying he had no right to stand in front of them. And they also said that the Scots staying in Wisconsin made no difference. US citizens had the right to take their property into territories. And so this deems like the Missouri Compromise to be illegal. And this is seen as a huge victory for the South, because this seems to suggest that restrictions on slave ownership cannot be constitutionally imposed, because it's saying if you are a slave owner, you can take your slaves wherever you like. And this makes no difference to their position. So a really kind of a tremendously important decision. Obviously, the reaction to this in the North and the reaction to this in the South are going to be very, very different. And there's a whole range of consequences, which we'll look at in the slides coming up. So Dred Scott himself, he is freed not long after this, but he's freed by Taylor Blow. Now, the Blow family we saw were helping him earlier. Irene Emerson sells the Scott family to the Blow family because she just remarried, and the man she'd married, Calvin Chaffee, I'm not sure I've said that right, but he was a congressman. He was horrified at her owning slaves. He was said to be an abolitionist, particularly in her owning a slave family as famous as the Scots, given the high profile of this court case. So the Blow family free the Scott family. Dred Scott was free for little over a year and died at age 59, according to reports of tuberculosis. Now, there's lots of other consequences of this. One of these is said to be economic. Now, with all the uncertainty that the Dred Scott case caused about what was going to happen with the Western Territories, and having seen already the violence of Bleeding Kansas we looked at in a previous video, the markets were gripped by a kind of a panic. There was lots of uncertainty about the East-West railroads, and it almost led to the collapse of several large banks. It was almost exclusively confined to the North, actually, this economic panic, which in its own way went on to harden the resolve of the South, as they started to say, well, look, our economic system's not been affected. King Cotton, as they have to refer to it, is still making us tons and tons of money. This is a problem with the Northern economic system, which is why we don't want to be so strongly connected to it anymore. So, Panic of 57, in part, led from the Dred Scott decision. Linked in with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this seemed to really kind of infuriate the North and kind of embolden the South. So essentially, what Taney and his Supreme Court have said is that the expansion of slavery is unhindered. So no one can make laws about where people can and cannot take their slaves. Therefore, if slave owners want to flood the Northern Territories and live in those territories with their slaves, they can do so. And it seemed to also kind of really confirm the constitutional position of slavery. So it links in with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it heightened the tensions over that, suggesting that any restriction on slavery essentially wasn't going to stick in the territories. Political consequences, and we've looked at this in one of the previous videos, it feeds into the rise of the Republicans. Now, Lincoln really stressed the importance of the Dred Scott case, particularly in his House Divided speech at Springfield. And it really does look like the need for a northern party, a sectional party, is highlighted by the Dred Scott decision. And what Lincoln, and you can see the quote from him next to me, but what Lincoln and others emphasized was essentially, up until this point, slavery has been an issue for the North, where they go, well, we morally, we don't like it, we don't think it should exist, we're opposed to it, but it's not on our doorstep. It's the state's issue. So there are abolitionists, but most people are not trying to remove slavery where it already exists. They are just trying to stop it expanding. But for most Northerners, it's not something of immediate concern. Now, the Dred Scott decision changes that, because what it could mean is that your new next door neighbour could be a slave owner who brings their slaves with them. And according to the Dred Scott decision, there was nothing that could be done to stop that happening. So it really does bring home a kind of fear of slavery and hatred of slavery amongst the northern population. So it also has a lot of big consequences for Northern Democrats. Now, ultimately, we'll see when we get to 1860, really the Democrats been seen pretty much as the party of the South and Republicans the party of the North as we get into the war. But up until this point, the Democrats have been a national party, and they've appealed in both the North and the South. And one of their most famous members, Stephen Douglas, that we've seen in the 1850 Compromise, that we've seen in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is a Northerner. And Douglas and others suddenly faced a very difficult position, because if they're going to appeal to a Northern electorate and they're going to get elected, then standing behind the Dred Scott decision is going to put them in a really difficult position. But if they oppose the Dred Scott decision, that's going to put them in a very difficult position within their party, because a lot of the Southern Democrats obviously are absolutely ecstatic about the decision. So Douglas came up with this idea, which he called the Freeport Doctrine, that if the territory never really had slavery take root, and there were no kind of local police regulations to protect it, then essentially any territory could refuse to have slavery within its borders. So he's trying to find some kind of middle way where he's going, right, look, if the people in an area are really absolutely opposed to it, then it cannot be imposed on them, just wasn't the same point saying to the people of the South, look, not having slavery cannot be imposed on you. Having slavery should not be being imposed on people in the North. And that's essentially what the Freeport Doctrine did. Now, Southern Democrats really didn't like this, and they argued there should be some kind of slave code for all territories that we passed to kind of protect it, and there was threats of secession. Now, this is really important in terms of the consequences of the Dred Scott case, because we start to see the falling out between Stephen Douglas and Southern Democrats, and that's going to be really, really important when we get to the 1860 election. Now, the supporters of slavery in the South were really happy with the decision. They hailed it as a kind of a true interpretation of the USA's Constitution. Jefferson Davis said this was really just a question about the position of black people in America and their position in American society. And he liked the decision. It is obviously, we look at it and we see it as being abhorrent. A lot of people in the North saw it as being as abhorrent. But at that particular point in time, there were people in the South who went, no, this is absolutely what the interpretation of the Constitution should be. So they're very happy. For those who don't support slavery, there are are lots of kind of societal consequences. We see a kind of explosion in the northern press opposing it. We see this growing belief in this idea of a slave power conspiracy, which Taney and Buchanan are part of. We believe that we see that there's this belief amongst abolitionists and others that this was a kind of a trick, a kind of a step towards stopping things developing in the territories. So it was all, again, it's all part of the slave power conspiracy. And we start to see all legal arguments and all that kind of things coming in the north to try and preventing the spread of slavery. And a lot of what the northern focus on is the kind of the jurisdiction of the federal court in terms of what it could and couldn't rule on, and what was in the federal government and what was in the state government, and what fell under the territorial governments. So we see a lot of anger in response to the Dred Scott decision in the north. So thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And we will continue, or I will continue, to make videos on these. Please comment on them. Tell me if there's more you need to know, or if you've got any questions. And I will keep on adding as we go through this period of American history. So my next video will be on the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Right, thank you again.